I think we will start, and I would like to apologise for the rain, though obviously it wasn't anything we could do about. But there are some seats at the back because several people we know haven't yet made it, so there will be coming people in and out, but it will be at the back and hopefully not too disturbing. And thank you for those of you who managed to get to us through that downpour. So welcome to this seminar series, which celebrates two things. One is the 20th anniversary of the founding of the Institute of Population Ageing in June 1998. This is our sort of celebratory seminar series. And also it's a seminar series on populism and science, which we felt was a very apt seminar series to run. So welcome to the Oxford Martin School. Many of you will know that this was founded in 2005 by James Martin. In fact, at that stage, it was called the James Martin School for the 21st Century, and I think that really describes what the benefactor's idea was, that we would look at issues and problems across the 21st century. And we have about 35 institutes here. The Institute of Population Ageing is one of them, but we range all the way from the hard sciences across into the humanities, via the social sciences, the life sciences, etc. So some people say, why would a demography institute be interested in science and communication? When we were founded 20 years ago, very much our remit was to look at the relationship with the kind of academic work we were doing and the way it interacted with policy and the practitioner and the general public. In fact, we were doing public engagement with science when public engagement with science hadn't really been invented as a term. And definitely, many of the people who I work with are aware that the kind of trends that we work with, trends around reproductive medicine, trends around longevity, trends around migration, are raising all sorts of issues that policy and public debate need to be involved with. And that was the background for us as to why we wanted this particular series to celebrate 2 decades of research here at Oxford. I can see many familiar faces, and I know that we have several of you who have followed the series from the beginning, but many have also come tonight to hear Nicky. So before I introduce her to you, let me just very quickly remind you about the idea of the series. And that is because in the world of experts who are looking at populism, very much the debate is moving away just from politics to the idea that now all experts are something that the popular movement should start to question. So we know that there is questioning of people in the arts, people in education, people in science. We've all been put into this elite category. And that today, I think, makes being a scientist particularly problematic if you want to be able to convey your findings, your empirical evidence in a way that is acceptable to both policymakers and to the public. So we started this series with a speaker from the Policy Lab at the Cabinet Office who was talking about the British government's ideas about trying to move from just the provider across to the consumer of policy and science. We then had a very lively debate with Fiona Fox from the Science Media Centre talking about the role of the journalists in science. Last week we had the CEO of the British Science Association and the new editor of The New Scientist talking about how can we really communicate science and increase an understanding of the scientific process. And so we're delighted tonight that we're going to have Nicky Hawkins, who has been doing some amazing work. Many of you may have read, she writes quite regularly in The Guardian, about this idea that how can you bring the scientific expert and the general public together in a way that is of reciprocal benefit. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of background. Nicky is the communication strategist for the Frameworks Institute working in the United Kingdom. She has a degree in English literature and a postgraduate degree in public relations. She has worked for a variety of non-profit organisations, which is everything from climate change through to child poverty. And as I say, she regularly blogs and writes, including in The Guardian, and is passionate about communication that changes minds. So, Nicky, thank you very much for coming, and we look forward to your talk.
Hello everyone, can you hear me okay? Yes, great. So thank you very much for coming in the rain to be part of this session. It's an honour to be here, and I appreciate you sharing the start of your evening with me. So my sole objective for our time together is to be helpful. I'd love to add some value to the important work that you're all doing. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about myself. Thank you for the introduction, but I'm going to sort of fill in some of the detail there. But before I did that, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the idea of this post-truth world that we're all hearing a lot about being part of at the moment. And I don't know about you, but every time I hear people saying we live in a post-truth world, I want to ask when the truth world was. So that time that we calmly, dispassionately won people over by simply stating statistics, the time when pointing out that people were wrong resulted in them thanking you and just taking on your version of the truth. And that time when telling people just how bad a situation was made them immediately want to do everything in their power to solve it. And that time obviously never happened. And that's not to say that there aren't tremendous shifts going on in how information is being produced and consumed that have a big impact on a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about. But the concept of post-truth, I think, risks making a fad out of some fundamental features of human cognition that absolutely aren't new. And there's a danger that it gets us off the hook when it comes to communicating knowledge and expertise. If we're living in a post-truth world where everyone's addicted to fake news, why do we even bother trying to address this? So, the British public is wrong about everything, nearly everything. A survey shows, and research shows that public opinion deviates from facts on key social issues, including crime, benefit fraud, and immigration. And I'm sure that we could add a lot of the issues that you in this room work on to that list. And I think this matters. I think it matters hugely. And I think that everyone in this room is interested in advancing new ideas, policies, and behaviours in society. And public opinion matters enormously. It can either provide a fertile ground for change, or it can feel more like an arid desert where facts and ideas struggle to thrive. And that leads me to tell you a little bit more about me. So I work for the Frameworks Institute. We're a Washington, DC-based, non-profit social science communications research think tank. So no one in my family has the faintest clue what any of that means. So I hope that by the end of this talk, you might be a little bit more clued up than they are. And I'd like to tell you about how I got here. You might be able to tell from my accent that I'm not from the DC area. And I've spent the last 15 years working in the UK, communicating and campaigning on issues like climate change and child poverty, disability, and human rights. So I worked out how to generate headlines, often based on academic research reports, and how to grab politicians' attention. This is a somewhat younger Jeremy Corbyn riding a bucking bronco outside Parliament in support for a campaign for sustainable livestock legislation. I was also part of the successful campaign for the UK to adopt the world's first Climate Change Act. It was a really hopeful moment, and I felt that change and progress was possible. I then watched on as this happened. David Cameron axed a whole swathe of green policies, saying, get rid of the green crap. Theresa May then took things a step further and got rid of the whole Department for Climate Change. Things that would have been unthinkable just a few years before this were suddenly not only happening, they were happening without much public concern and certainly no outcry. So I think my former colleagues and I had thought that addressing climate change was now normal, culturally, and I think we overestimated the extent to which this was true. Oh, and we had this going on, and this. And with this backdrop, I felt it was more important than ever for experts and communicators to understand how attitudes and cultural norms change. And it was at this point that my journey with the Frameworks Institute began. So I'd like to talk to you about two things this evening. What is framing, the frame part of the Frameworks Institute, and why does it matter? And how can we frame scientific authority more effectively? So firstly, what is framing? Just so we have a common definition, we see framing as how differences in the presentation of information impact sometimes dramatically on the effect of that information. It's all about how we choose to talk and explain, the ideas and the language that we use, the stories that we tell, and the impact of all those choices. So first up, I wondered if anyone in this room has experienced this kind of situation. So you're explaining something complicated with brilliant clarity. You've got this great way of talking about antimicrobial resistance, and somehow you're not being heard or understood. Or worse, you might be actively being misunderstood. Can I have a show of hands? Has anyone experienced that kind of thing? So probably most people, yeah. So I want to reassure you that this is 100% normal by showing you some footage from some of our research. So at Frameworks, we've spent the last 15 years working with the Harvard University Center on the Developing Child to translate the science of early brain development. And this is where this work began. So this is a kind of standard message based on a large body of science. For those studying early childhood, this is kind of uncontroversial, entry-level stuff. But when we took this message out to normal people, our researchers were hearing something else completely, and it was something that sounded a bit like this.
Life's hard. It's supposed to be hard. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. All the bad cliches you can think of. I mean, there's been people that have come from absolutely nothing to make it in whatever society's eyes deems success.
And this was a very normal thing to think. Our research showed that this gentleman was not an outlier. This was a very normal, a normal way of responding to a message like this one from the experts. And I think this shows us that seemingly straightforward factual messages like this can get lost in translation when they collide with the existing stories in people's heads. In this case, it's the story that adversity is character building, even for young children. And that's a story that's deep in American culture and has profound effects on how people make sense of the world. And now, in case you're more of a hard data kind of a group, I'd like to show you some quantitative data from a different area of our research. So we run experiments to test the impact of different ways of framing an issue. And we test for a different range of desired communications outcomes. They might be the salience of an issue, or how people understand an issue, or how much people support a particular type of policy change. And in this case, we wanted to test how varying the framing of UK criminal justice reform affected the UK public's support for different policies. So we tested 2 different frames against a control group that received no message at all. And the first was a message around problem solving. It played to the idea that we Brits are cool-headed and pragmatic. We need to take a common sense and practical approach to solve the problem of our over-reliance on prisons and harsh punishments. A second message led with the fact that our criminal justice system is costly and ineffective. Investment in rehabilitation saves money and improves outcomes. And what happened to people's support for policy change following exposure to these messages? So the problem-solving message increased support to a statistically significant degree. The cost efficiency message reduced support. It was worse than saying nothing at all. For advocates who were wanting to seek policy change, it was doing harm to their cause. And it was a very frequently used message in that sphere. I wondered if anyone had any ideas as to why that's happening. Anyone want to be brave? It's not a trick question. Yeah, thank you. It's a version of that. That's not a million miles away. It is to do with cost.
Does cost mean spending more money?
It's not quite that.
Okay. If you talk about cost efficiency, that's why you're doing it, and it's going to be worse because it's budget version rather than a neutral way of saying it could be different and therefore potentially better.
So I think that's part of what's going on, and I think you're edging closer. But I think there is a more specific thing that is being a way of thinking about the criminal justice system and criminal justice generally that is being activated when you think about cost.
So basically people are thinking maybe people need
bingo. The story is activating in people's heads is that there is no price on justice. So it's the pure mention of price in relation to this issue just makes people think, I don't care about how much this costs, I care about people being punished and locked up, and I care about safety. So this is a good illustration of how understanding is frame dependent, and how when we frame issues differently, we can see quite radically different results. And I've got another short clip derived from some different pieces of research that we've done, which see two different people talking about two different issues in two different ways. And your job here is to spot the difference between the two.
So somebody who's addicted to cigarettes chose to have those first few drags and rip the shit out of their throat and become addicted to cigarettes. Alcohol, they chose to have enough alcohol to end up addicted to it. As I said initially, leading to addiction is the susceptibility to addiction. And if you aren't exposed to it, and especially at sensitive times or at critical times, then you might not end up addicted.
So what do you think about stress?
It's a normal part of development, in my opinion.
What's the effect or the role of stress? Again, thinking about young kids.
That causes, in my opinion, long-term damage to a child. A lot of the emotional developments, the learnings that are meant to take place wouldn't happen in that situation.
So did you spot the difference? Yeah, it's not a trick question. So the chap goes from pure choice to susceptibility and biology, which for people working on the science of addiction is a significant shift. And the lady goes from stress in childhood is normal to stress damages development. So these are both big shifts in the understanding that experts working on these issues are seeking to build. And they happen because these people have been read a short but very well tested and well honed way of framing these issues. But perhaps the most important thing that I want to draw your attention to in those clips, and I don't know if you noticed it, are the things that they said at the start of their second statement. Did you spot either of them? You're chuckling. What did they say? Yeah. So she says, in my opinion, before and after. And he says, as I said initially in his second statement. It's not what he said initially. It's absolutely not what he said. And she repeats, in my opinion. So the thing is that this tells us is they are both her opinion. People have multiple ways of understanding issues, and they are rarely ideologically consistent. They have lots of different stories in their heads, and they're often contradictory ones. And we can frame in a way that reminds people and builds on these productive ideas that people already hold. And that's what we do at the Frameworks Institute. And it's now compulsory for all presentations like this to have a theory of change. And this is ours at Frameworks. So we work on communications by applying the same level of rigor to communications research as we do to gathering evidence on other issues. We're by no means alone in this. There's lots of great work happening in social marketing and behaviour change. But where we differ to many groups is what we're doing the research for. So rather than seeking to influence at an individual behaviour level, we're focusing on communications that have the power to shape the public discourse. The ideas that over time can shift attitudes and public thinking in deep and abiding ways. And we do this to create the space and the appetite for sustained policy change. This is not always a linear process. This is a deceptively simple illustration. And sometimes ambitious policy changes need us to work backwards to shore up that fertile ground that I talked about at the beginning. But this is basically what we're all about. So on to the meat of this talk. Can I do anything to help you to frame your science? So in order to try and make sense of this very complicated task, I've pulled some bits of research from a few different places and have loosely grouped them into three big ideas. You might have seen or heard some of these examples before, but I hope to offer some new perspectives, and I'm very keen to hear your response when we chat at the end. So, first up, when we feel there's a lot of misinformation flying around, it's a very natural and logical thing to want to do to set people straight. And a 2006 study explored what this fact-checking leaflet did to people's thinking about the flu vaccine. So this was a real leaflet produced by the Centre for Disease Control in the States. It led with the myths, the inaccurate ideas that people hold and held, and then it helpfully revealed the facts that contradicted them. So, what happened as a result of reading this leaflet? The researchers found that people misremembered the myths as true. It got worse over time, and they attributed the false information to the CDC, which is absolutely not the effect that they were seeking to have with this information. And there's a broader lesson arising from this. I kind of made it my mission to try and stamp out the practice of fact-checking and myth-busting. But there's a broader lesson here that this tells us, and it shows the power of priming. Reminding people what they already know and then thinking you can rationally argue them out of that position is simply not how cognition works. And if we think about communications as a process of correcting or filling people up with data, we're ignoring the power of those stories that are already in people's heads. And those existing stories in people's heads have a strategic advantage. They're already right there, and they don't simply budge when they're shifted with new information. So when at Frameworks we research how to frame an issue, we start off by mapping these existing ways of thinking that people bring to an issue, their default assumptions and the beliefs they draw on when they're making meaning of a communication on a given issue. And I'd like to share with you some of the assumptions and beliefs that people bring to bear on the issue of science itself. So how do people think about science? Our research involves comparing the expert story to the public story. And these are some of the dominant stories that members of the public tell themselves about science. They're taken from our research in the US, but I guarantee that some of these stories will be familiar to you, probably all too familiar. So one of them is the idea that there's a new story every week, which could be somewhat positive, but it's not. You don't know what to believe. You hear this, you hear that, and you hear different contradictory things. All these studies you hear, don't eat this, and then 3 months later, oh, that's good for you. So I think that for people researching issues and getting to grips with evidence, it's a positive thing that science evolves and science changes and scientists are able to shift when new evidence emerges. But this isn't well understood by the public, and it kind of morphs into this way of thinking about science. So one of the other ways that people think about science is that research just means look it up. I do a lot of research just because I'm nosy, and it's so easy to Google and just find a topic. I also enjoy cooking quite a bit, so I research recipes. So the concept of research, and particularly empirical research, is not well understood by members of the public. Predictions are just guesses. We can make predictions of what's going on, but we don't know if they are actually going to happen. So I think this is particularly problematic for anyone doing research that involves modelling, and it's a line of thinking that requires quite a lot of navigation when it comes to talking about research that involves predictions. But there is some more hopeful news. There are other ways that people have of thinking about science. First up, science solves problems. Who knows what they will come up with in the future? All these environmental problems could go away in the blink of an eye just because of some new invention. So there's obviously some cause for concern in there, but there's also this deep sense that science does solve the problems that we need it to solve, which is fundamentally a good thing that we need people to believe about science. We learn from science. I absolutely love science. I watch science shows all the time on TV. It's amazing learning about animals or outer space or how they are finding cures for diseases. Whatever it is, I just find it so interesting. And science is practical. I mean, if you think about it, where would we be without science? So the thing about all these different stories that people tell themselves is that they are contradictory. People are more than capable of shifting, of toggling between wildly different views. And if we can craft communications that deliberately activate the productive ideas that people have whilst skirting round the less productive ones, we can be massively more effective as communicators of science. So as an example of where that may not have been achieved, I wondered if you could have a quick look at this media article and have a think about which stories this is activating. So which of the stories in people's heads is this really triggering? Yeah, that's definitely one of them.
Climate change is not real?
I mean, that's definitely will be there when it comes to the issue of climate change, but when it comes to the issue of science, what does this make people think about science?
Predictions or guesses?
Very good, yes. So it's activating two deeply held assumptions that people have when it comes to science and setting people on that course. And once people are on that course, it's very difficult for them to come back from it. And actually this story is fundamentally quite a positive one when it comes to what it's saying about climate change, but also what it's saying about science. The idea that scientists change their views in response to emerging evidence and new data. This is a positive thing, but it's very, very difficult to get the public to see that. And it's easy to blame the media, and I am interested to hear about the lively debate you had about the role of media in science reporting. And of course the media has a role to play, but so does the scientific community. And I wanted to kind of highlight this very frequently deployed defense of climate science. So the idea that 97% of climate scientists agree that, well, 97% of research papers say that climate change is happening. And I wondered what beliefs and feelings that's activating around science, what people think about science. Anyone thinking? I mean, I think it's tapping into similar models, similar patterns of thinking to the Times article. It's not having the effect on public thinking that I think that people who produce this research would like to think it does. And our research would suggest that there are more effective ways to frame this issue. So I'd like to give you a little snapshot from a different experimental survey that we ran, this time from 2014 research into framing climate change in the US. So again, it's an experiment that's looking for the impact of different frames against a control group that hears nothing. So we have a scientific authority frame, which emphasizes expert authority and the importance of evidence. We have a responsible management frame, which is about we need a common sense, step-by-step approach to responsibly developing long-term plans that act in the interest of future generations. And we have a protection frame. So this emphasizes the need to shield people and places from harm. And this is what happened when we carried out this experiment. So the protection frame was the only way of talking about this issue that had a statistically significant positive impact on people's support for climate policies. And I really want to draw your attention to the scientific authority frame, which was virtually indistinguishable from saying nothing at all. And I wanted to pause here and have you all hazard a guess as to why that's happening. So this is just one experiment, but it's consistent with certainly our findings and broader findings from other research. So why is it that science says is the least effective way to frame this issue? Yep. That's definitely part of it. Anything else?
Just the scientific data doesn't tie consequences to your life. We're scaring people. It's effective in that aspect. Doesn't even matter if the data is true or not. Fear effect.
I think that there is something in that. I think that I think my view on this is probably somewhat simpler, which is that the meaning and the value that is imbued in the idea of scientific authority for probably everyone in this room is not felt and understood by most people in the public. So principles like empiricism and peer review and everything that you hold dear about science are not widely understood or appreciated. So when you say science, people simply don't hear what you hear. So in terms of my big idea about the shift that we need to make, and I would say that this is a fairly ubiquitous way of framing science. It makes most sense to scientists. It's all about emphasizing the evidence. But in order for people to be open to hearing your evidence, you need to provide cues that help them make sense of not just what it means, but why it matters. So I think that the thing about this way of framing science is that often it can feel implicit. So if you're presenting information about serious threats to life as we know it, of course people will take away a sense of why that matters. But given how many ways people have to disregard or dismiss what you're saying, you need to help them to see what they're saying. You need to cue very intentionally how you want people to interpret what it is you're saying. And this leads very nicely onto a guessing game that I have. It's a short one. So in the last week, all of these issues and events, I'm about to read you a list of issues and events, and they've been described in headlines in the British press in the exact same way, using the exact same word. I'm going to read you the list, and at the end, I want someone to guess the common word. It's important to say that I tried this on my husband, and he didn't get it, so you have to prove that collectively you're smarter than him. I have no doubt that you will do. So the list is liberal democracy, obesity, the region of Qatar, the country of Italy, citizenship, social care, air pollution, crabs, inequality, news itself, music festivals, the Euro. Very good, yes. It's not a trick question. Another guessing game, what's the impact of all of those issues being framed as a crisis on how people interpret the idea of a crisis?
Anything can be framed as a crisis?
Yep. And if anything can be framed as a crisis, nothing really is a crisis, yeah. So we experience crisis inflation, and crisis frames either have no impact or they spark disbelief or abject fatalism, which is rarely what communicators are trying to achieve when they go down the crisis route. So again, it's easy to attribute this ubiquitous crisis frame to the media, but scientists tend to lean heavily on it too. So a couple of examples. So on these issues, the attempt to up the urgency and the stakes is completely understandable. We've gone from crisis frame to an Armageddon frame. And these crises are genuine. They're serious, serious challenges. But a diagnosis of the situation is not the same as a communication strategy. And our research on framing a wide range of issues shows that a pure crisis message does not deliver the effects that we would like it to. So in terms of the big shift that I think we need to make, we need to move from crisis to efficacy. My colleague at Frameworks talks about the 90-10 rule. So experts provide a vivid, detailed, urgent outline of a problem and a very small, missable nod to the solutions. We need to let the solutions take centre stage, and we need to balance problems with a sense that change is possible. Which brings me, so in an attempt to not be too crisis-focused with you guys, I wanted to show you something positive. I wanted to show you one of my favourite headlines of recent years. How renewable energy became unstoppable. So I particularly liked this story because it was around the same time, and it was against the backdrop of Trump pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement. But it's not telling that story. It's not giving him the power. Instead, it's a positive assertion of the reality that we want, and it's making that inevitable, rather than getting trapped in this outdated, unproductive argument that's been holding people who care about climate change back for many years. And this applies to whatever issue you're working on. We need many, many more of these stories to make the ideas we're seeking to drive normal. So, my last question for you is, how do we frame complexity? I think it must be something you struggle with all the time as scientists and communicators of science. And I think a standard kind of communicating science training session would probably say that we need to simplify, and we need to stop bamboozling people with complicated concepts and bewildering language. And I think that there's certainly some truth in that, and I love simple language, but I believe that this is only half the answer. And in order to uncover the other half, I'm going to carry out an experiment on you. So all you need to do is you just need to watch this short video. So I need a show of hands now. Who made up a story as they were watching that? I think that's pretty much all of you. That's good news, you're all normal. You might not feel that normal, but you are. Does anyone want to share the story that they made up? Go on, be brave. Come on, somebody. There we go.
Story about a predator who escapes imprisonment and threatens the welfare of the populace.
I think that's a fairly common one that people go for, is definitely some imprisonment going on. Did anyone else have anything different to that? It's the lady here.
Maybe it's just me, but I saw an extramarital affair.
Yeah, star-crossed lovers. Yeah, that's a standard theme. I tested this on a friend recently, and he said, well, that's basically Jurassic Park. And I would just like to remind you that these are just some shapes moving around a screen in a very primitive way. And what this tells us, and what the original designers of this experiment found, is that this shows us that we think in stories. We all see stories, whether or not we're being told stories. The original study was carried out in 1944, and it's been replicated many times since. And storytelling is something that you can do as science communicators. So I think that if we stop short at making science accessible and trying to remove bewildering complexity, we're missing the next step, which is that we need to go from complexity to story. We need to tell stories about knowledge and evidence. Stories that are imbued with an inescapable sense of why something matters, and stories that are memorable, stories that explain and bring science and the scientific process to life. And we can find out which stories work best through an empirical scientific process. And with that, I'm going to finish with a poster that we made for the March for Science in the States a couple of years ago. And I'm going to ask you if you would like to ask any questions.
Thank you very much. What you will not be aware of is, in actual fact, so many of the themes that you talked about are things that we have discussed over the last few weeks. One of the things is this general feeling that there is a new story every week. Yeah. That research means looking it up. We had a long discussion about the impact of Google and how we can all get access to information, but where's knowledge gone to? Predictions are just guesses was something else that we talked about. And probably one of the things I think that sort of ran through this, and you said it very beautifully, far more eloquently than we put it together, is that the meaning and value embedded in scientific authority is not understood. So you have provided a wonderful link with the themes that have come out. So thank you very much. And I'm sure there are lots of questions that people would like to ask. And we have one from Stephen.
Is it still on? Yes, it is. Can I go with a couple of quotes and then it's sort of a statement question, but I think it's really relevant to what we're talking about. All right, I'm going to go with the quote first. There's no point in taking the time to make evidence-based solutions easier to understand if policymakers are no longer interested. Successful advocates recognise the value of emotional appeals and simple stories to draw attention to a problem. So I was writing that out just as you were doing that video. That's Paul Kearney, who is a really interesting political thinker. And another quote, which is by an artist. Facts are one part. Just as guilt does not inspire initiative, people will not act on facts alone. We are inspired to act by emotional and physical experience. And I think your talk was getting to, your talk went through a lot of very interesting things, I think, quite quickly and in high level, and there's much more to go into in all of those. But I think the point about, how did you describe it, efficacy? I thought that was really interesting, and agency. And I've done quite a lot of work in a policy context and in an artistic context about giving people agency in this kind of thing. And I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit more about that.
I think in terms of the issue of efficacy, I think that what really matters here is how people are finishing the story. So if people think in stories and they are constantly kind of inserting the existing stories in their own heads into the communication stimulus that they're being provided with, if you stop at a "this is big and bad" message, that's where you will leave people. And that is essentially paralyzing people with something that feels unfixable. And I think that for me, this was quite a kind of thunderbolt moment when I learned about this, having worked in kind of communicating environmental and other very challenging issues, and needing and wanting to tell people how bad it was. And I think that's very instinctive, and to want to share a situation that you feel a kind of a need to share, both kind of morally, but also in terms of we need this to be out there so that it's accepted as truth and it has an influence on policy and all of that stuff. But it doesn't work, I think. And so the shift to efficacy is I think something that we have to do, and we have to see that the crisis frames aren't working. They're fundamentally not working. They're not doing the job that we intend when we put them out there, and hope that they're going to result in these kind of mass epiphanies that transform the landscape. In terms of your first quote, that there's no point in there's no point in
taking the time to make evidence-based solutions easier to understand if policymakers are no longer interested. So it's about policymakers, not necessarily about the public. But it kind of touches on this idea of supply and demand for evidence.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people in this room will be working on supply of that. Does everyone care? I think that's a really interesting question.
I'm interested in whether that's something people feel. Is that, that's a sense of fatalism that you might all have, why bother?
In the context of that is that the person who asked the question works for the Cabinet Office.
Yeah.
So, and has worked in the Government Office of Science for quite a long time. And this is something that you feel quite strongly?
I feel strongly about it. Not necessarily representing the government in that.
Right.
I'm also an artist who's just finished an MA, and a lot of my work is on art and science and the relationship between those.
I mean, we have Roger Highfield who's coming in a couple of weeks' time, and he says that in the light of policy becoming more interested in the public, there is this fear that we move from evidence-based policy to policy-based evidence. And I think that's quite a nice shift. And definitely one of the things we were talking about in the first, when Andrea came from the policy lab, was talking about this shift, which could be potentially dangerous, but trying to understand what the public wanted in terms of policy and how that then fitted in with scientific evidence, which in many ways is exactly what you were talking about right at the very beginning.
I don't think there ever was there ever a time of kind of pure evidence-based policy making? That feels like a mythical time, certainly in my experience. And I think that, we've seen a lot recently that has been kind of public thinking transforming policies in very immediate ways. So the Windrush scandal and the public outcry around that had a dramatic effect on a particular aspect of a particular policy. I'm not saying it's job done, but it was all around the framing of that. It was around the fact that people could see that this was real people. They could identify with those people, and there was a moral frame to it. It was that this is just not right, and we don't accept that happening in our society, and this is not the kind of society that we want to be. And I think it was all in the way that it was framed that actually resulted in the government accepting some responsibility for a policy that we as a society didn't want to get behind. So I think I can't believe that there isn't that link when you see it every day. Maybe not every day, but quite often.
Delia.
I wonder if you could say a bit about how you generate your frames. And that relates to whether it matters for your theory of change where frames come from. I was struck in your very first video of the guy saying, you have to overcome stuff early on in life in order to succeed, sort of Horatio Alger kind of thing, and that's a very American stereotype, stroke myth. But some of your other examples, like criminal justice, seem to be more universal. So does it matter where frames come from, and how do you guys, you just grab them out of the air, or?
So when we test frames, that's towards the end of the research process that we've been through. So the first stage of our research process is to map the kind of frames that are out there currently, and we do that in a number of ways. We map the kind of, what's the expert story? What's the story that experts on this issue really want to tell? What's the public story? What are people telling themselves? In these kind of multiple different, often contradictory ways. We also map the kind of media discourse on the issue, and we map what people who are communicating the issue are saying. And we kind of look at all that as a whole, so you can kind of make sense of what people are hearing, where are they getting it from. We identify what the more kind of productive models people have for thinking about an issue are, and therefore how you might design frames and communications that would trigger those productive ways of thinking. So we have what we call a kind of metaphor kitchen. We tend we're looking to design frames that are values frames, story frames, metaphor frames, and others as well. But in order to intentionally cue the productive stories that people are already telling themselves. So it's a really, that bit at the end with the graph really is the end of a long process. And we often kind of know what's likely to be working when it comes to how you frame a particular issue. Sometimes we test frames that we suspect don't work, but are very commonly used by a sector or a field of communicators in order to show them. I think that was what we did on criminal justice, to say, you say this all the time, look at the impact it's having. And sometimes we test things that we think will bomb, and then they end up being the ones that actually work really well. So there's always some surprises along the way, and then there's always interpretation to be done in terms of why is that one working, why is that one not, what's that cueing, and that's where the fun is. Sorry, that's a long answer to
something I should have said is to remind you all this is being recorded and streamed, and so if you don't want to be recorded and streamed, please don't ask a question. Sorry. Okay. But Lauren is very happy to be recorded and streamed, so.
I guess I have to now. There's this idea from, that some of us learned from sort of public policy school about a policy window being open, where sort of the story and the willingness to work on something hard, and sort of there's this confluence of events. Oh, sorry, there's this, what's my hands? There's a confluence of events that allows for a policy window to be open, and I always liked that idea, and I wondered if you have thoughts about whether or not any policy window could be opened if the framing was done properly, because there still needs to be a willingness, and especially when there's a lot of money involved, the right sort of economic environment as well.
So I think the way that we design our experiments, we're testing for quite a few different sort of features or outcomes for a frame to achieve, some of which are deliberately attempting to kind of open that policy window. So the salience of an issue, are people seeing, is this top of mind? Is this something that people think is important in a given moment? So we can design frames that we know we're confident are doing that job. The support for particular policy change. So if we can see that a frame in our testing has the power to drive support in the right direction, that can help us to help communicators in the field to push that window open. I think that it's really interesting how else those windows open, and I think probably the Windrush the outcry around that and what that did is a really interesting example, because it was something that was being kind of chipped away at for a long time, and then suddenly the window opened. And I think that some of that was framing, but I don't think framing was the whole answer.
Okay, I've got a few thoughts on the Windrush thing because my organisation, the Migration Observatory, was vaguely involved in some of the data that helped to support that. But I'll come back to that in a minute. I just wanted to start off by asking a question. You've got a background in PR, and you've done sort of academic PR. You've done a degree in it, I think, haven't you? So I presume that you've come across the work of people like Edward Bernays. And I wonder to what extent what you're talking about differs from the concept of the engineering of consent, which is obviously what Bernays, I mean, that's sort of the core to some extent of Bernays' idea about these things, which in itself brings with it kind of complexities and problems insofar as it's not only the good guys, as it were, who can go through the process of engineering consent. And I think a lot of what you've been talking about has been focused on how do we frame things in a positive way, but it's not necessarily been addressing the question of the counter arguments that are being placed by other people, and other people can also. I mean, one of the things you were talking about was the idea of activating productive ideas and maybe skirting around the unproductive ones. But of course, you know, I mean, those of us who believe that our ideas are productive or who want to activate those kind of productive attitudes in society are somewhat limited by the fact that we're not the only people who are involved in the debate. There are multiple sides and multiple different people who also want to activate their own ideas, and indeed they believe their own ideas to be productive. Yeah. You know, I've had a meeting with an organisation that campaigns against migration for some time ago, and the meeting ended with this person saying to me, "You do realise, Rob, we think we're the good guys here." And I think it's very important that we recognise that we aren't all necessarily in that position of being able to say that we're solidly on, you know, the kind of the moral, the right moral side, as it were. So I suppose that's an issue, and there's also an issue that relates to that, which is about the essentially what one might think of as the means of production, because we are attempting to participate in debates. Those debates are held in locations which we don't have control over, i.e. the media. Now, again, you've been sort of I mean, the media, I mean, obviously social media, we have some degree of control over what's in there, but I mean, social media in itself is heavily influenced by traditional media, legacy media, whatever you want to call it. So I guess my fundamental question is there a moral challenge in your concept of framing? And what is it, I mean, or do you think that it's just fundamentally a good thing?
Oh, I've got so much to say. So I think you're completely right that it's a great load of questions that you asked. I
didn't do the Windrush bit either, which
and I think, you know, framing is always a contest. Sometimes it's more of a contest than others. On some issues, it's more of a contest. And I think what very often happens is that when it's particularly contested, you end up kind of dancing in other people's frames. A sort of poetic way to put it, that you struggle to get that kind of positive assertion of your own story out there because you're so busy kind of responding to, attempting to rebut and kind of debate and kind of colliding with that counter-narrative. So, you know, framing never kind of happens in a vacuum. And I think the other thing is that framing, you know, is a process that's happening anyway. You know, we're always making choices about how to present information. So when I talk to my family, I'm always, you know, thinking about how I can explain something to them, or in the case of my children, how I can make them do what I want them to do, which is often not successful. So I think that for me, this issue of the kind of the morality of it is about framing what we think is important and right based on evidence, and making choices that are based on good evidence as opposed to partial evidence. And that's what we are trying to do at Frameworks.
Can I respond? Do you mind if I respond to that?
You can quickly. I don't know how we get you the microphone because it's already gone.
I can speak loudly.
It's more for the YouTube.
So just a quick response to that,
and
which,
then we have three
which
more
brings in the Windrush dimension to this, is that one of the slight challenges that I had with the title of this in the first place was that I think statistics are really, really important and they play a fundamental role. And the role of the academy, to some extent, needs to be to provide a sort of essentially a solid base for debate, whether or not it's pushing things in one direction or another. So on the Windrush thing, for example, Amelia Gentleman, in her explanation of how she went through the process of actually identifying that this was a major problem and really pushing it hard, specified that actually some data that we provided her about the actual size of that Windrush generation cohort who potentially were at risk actually was what gave her the ability to recognise that this was something that was fundamental and really a big deal. Yeah. So I think, I'm not trying to have a go at the title, I think that statistics are fundamental and really important, and the Academy needs to be focused on being right.
I completely agree. I just don't think they're the whole answer.
Agreed. I also agree with that.
Okay, so we have a lady at the back, then we have the man at the front, and then we have a man over there, and then sadly we're going to have to stop.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah, great. Thank you so much. This is very relevant to my work, so I have a couple of questions and comments. So my work for my PhD is, so I'm a computer scientist, and my work was on analyzing the influence of online communications on people at the group level and the individual level. And now I'm working at the Oxford Internet Institute on analyzing junk news and junk science and the impact on people and so on. So I am aware of sort of George Lakoff's work on framing and how he says that, you know, if you present people with facts, if those disagree with people's opinion, they're going to keep their opinion and discard the facts and so on. So that's very interesting. So the point you made about people thinking that, oh, science contradicts itself and they find something, then they find the opposite is true. Because my work was also on causality, I think there's this problem where sometimes findings that are associational are presented as this causes the other, and then they find, oh, actually, no, this was just an association, the opposite holds. So that's also an issue, I think, in how science is communicated or how those press releases get written or how the media covers science. So that's a similar issue in this area. I'd be very interested to see actually like the findings of your research work and kind of also your methodology. Like, for example, when you had this graph, this plot of when people are presented with this is what a scientific authority says versus this is what a responsible managerial person says versus something else. I was thinking, okay, but maybe a scientific authority can also show that they're responsible, you know, so those things are not opposites, they overlap. So that's, for example, one case where I would be interested to see how did you frame this when you presented this to people? Like, was it the case that it was like, here is a scientist and here is a responsible manager? Because I don't know if that might prime them that, okay, so if this is a responsible manager, probably the scientist wasn't also responsible because we would have been told that. So it's all these interesting things. So how can you pull apart what was it in the message that caused people to change their mind or that it didn't? Because if you could then say, okay, this is a responsible scientist, would that increase the appeal of the scientific opinion, for example?
So that's a great question. It probably suggests that I didn't explain the experiment as well as I could have done. The way that we researched the effects of the frames that the graph was showing, and I should say that there's a fully referenced version of all our research available on our website. But the way we research it is that we're isolating the impact of the thing that's being said. So in that case, it wasn't about who was saying it, it was about what was being said. And it was about the essence of the message, which was around, we have a responsibility to responsibly manage our planet, versus we have a responsibility to protect people and places, versus this is what the evidence is telling us, climate change is happening. And I think that you're also right to say that it doesn't need to be binary. It doesn't need to be one or the other, that you can bring in the evidence and you can frame it well. You can bring in, here's the evidence and this is why it matters. And I think that that's where scientists should be. And I completely agree that this is never about abandoning statistics or saying that, you know, we shouldn't rely heavily on or entirely on data in making decisions. But we should also not mistake that reliance on data that we have as scientists and experts for how people are just going to absorb that information when they hear it.
Okay, and Tom.
Really quick question. Have you looked at the role of appealing to curiosity as a framing tool and found anything in that?
I'm sure we probably have. We've definitely kind of appealed to ingenuity, which is, I think, connected, and the idea of kind of creative, practical and creative approaches to solving problems. And it's context specific, and we often find that what works in one cultural context doesn't necessarily work in another. But on certain issues in certain areas, that's proved very effective. Tapping into people's sense of kind of ingenuity and priming them to believe that we as human beings can come up with the answers is very effective.
And then a last question.
People like us have these kinds of conversations a lot about the general public in our work, and it almost always focuses on the inability or the ability or inability of the public to consume what we try to feed them. But on the other hand, people who study science and scientists point out that there really is a credibility crisis in the natural sciences, and especially in the social sciences, which is more what you're talking about that relates to policy. I'm referring to the replication crisis, and that upward of 50% of what's published in the natural sciences is not replicable, and upward of 70% of what's published in the social sciences is not replicable. So it fails the first definition of the basic definition of science. And so I was wondering, when you craft a communications approach to making science more credible, on top of focusing on the public, is there also a strategy or a recommendation to science and to the peer review process or to the publication process or the science media process to be more rigorous, and to scientists to be more humble?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I think that I would like to think about the issue of humility, definitely, and I think that there is an issue of, I think particularly for me after Brexit, I wondered if a lot of the kind of experts on the economy felt a sense of humility in response to the Brexit vote, because it showed, I think, to a large degree, the kind of failure of their facts and their knowledge to wash with a much larger section of the public than they had assumed that they were talking to, and I think that was should be a constant kind of a moment of kind of checking ourselves in terms of how we are. Expertise shouldn't exist in a vacuum, and it should be held to account in terms of public thinking. And therefore, I think I agree with the sentiment of what you're saying, and we should be taking that very seriously.
Thank you. That's a very interesting to end on, and links very much into next week, where we have Robin Niblett, who's director of Chatham House, who's going to be coming and talking about how governments need to be more open with their people in the light of the way that facts are changing or being accepted, and what role does government have. So, but can we just thank you, Nicky, very much for a very stimulating talk.